The morning sun spilled over the rooftops of Crestwood, painting the quiet streets in soft gold. It was one of those rare, perfect spring days, cool enough to need a light jacket, warm enough to leave it in the car. Birds chirped from the trees lining the avenue, and the usual rush of downtown traffic hadn't yet kicked in. Everything felt calm, ordinary, the kind of morning that promised a productive day ahead. At precisely 8:17 a.m., a sleek, deep blue Lamborghini Huracan rolled to a smooth stop in front of City Hall. The car gleamed under the sunlight, its lines sharp and elegant. Not flashy in a loud way, but undeniably expensive. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a black woman in her late 40s, dressed in a crisp navy suit, low heels, and a simple gold pendant at her throat. She adjusted her blazer, took a slow breath, and glanced at her watch. She was early, good. The budget meeting was at 9, and she liked to arrive with time to spare to review her notes one last time. She'd bought the Lamborghini 2 years ago, not as a showpiece, but as a reward. After decades of public service, years of working double shifts to put herself through law school, then climbing the ranks in city planning before running for office, she'd finally allowed herself something beautiful, something that reminded her she'd made it, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been told they didn't belong in rooms like the one she was about to walk into. She locked the car with a soft beep, tucked her keys into her pocket, and started toward the grand stone steps of City Hall. Her heels clicked lightly on the pavement. A few early commuters passed by. Some nodded, others offered a quiet, "Good morning, Mayor." She smiled back each time. This was her city. She knew its rhythms, its people, its hidden struggles and quiet triumphs. She loved it fiercely. But before she'd taken 10 steps, 2 police cruisers pulled up behind her Lamborghini with sudden, jarring speed. Door slammed. Boots hit the pavement. Her stomach dropped, not from fear, but from the sheer unexpectedness of it. She turned slowly, hands relaxed at her sides. "Ma'am," one of the officers called out, his voice tight. "Step away from the vehicle. Now." She blinked. "Is everything okay, officers?" "Step away from the car," the second officer repeated, his hand resting near his holster. "Keep your hands where we can see them." She took a small step back, palms open. "Of course. This is my car. I was just heading into City Hall for a meeting." The first officer, a man with a buzz cut and a stiff posture, narrowed his eyes. "Your car? This Lamborghini?" "Yes," she said calmly. "I parked it here legally. See the permit on the dash?" He didn't look. Instead, he exchanged a glance with his partner. "We got a call about a suspicious person trying to break into a high-end vehicle in this area." She frowned. "That must be a mistake." "I'm not suspicious, I'm the mayor." At that, the second officer let out a short, skeptical laugh. "Right, and I'm the governor." She didn't flinch. "My name is Evelyn Thorne. I've been mayor of Crestwood for 18 months. My office is right there." She pointed to the third-floor window with the American flag outside. "If you check your radio, dispatch can confirm." But they weren't listening. The first officer stepped closer, his voice lowering but still edged with suspicion. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to prove the car belongs to you. Right now." "I can show you the registration," she said, reaching slowly for her purse. "Don't move." The second officer barked, stepping forward abruptly. "Keep your hands visible." She froze. "I was just getting my wallet," she said evenly. "The registration is in there." "You're not making this easy," the first officer muttered, as if she were the one causing trouble. A small crowd had begun to gather, office workers on their way in, a delivery guy pausing his cart, a woman walking her dog. Phones came out. Cameras pointed. The mayor felt the weight of their stares, but she kept her composure. She'd faced worse. She'd grown used to being doubted, underestimated, questioned, just for being a black woman in positions of authority. But this in front of her own city hall? It stung more than she expected. "Look," she said, voice steady but firm. "I understand you're doing your job, but I am not a suspect. I am your elected mayor. If you call dispatch or walk inside with me, this will be cleared up in 30 seconds. Instead of responding, the first officer pulled out his radio. "Unit 14, we have a possible stolen vehicle at City Hall. Female subject, black, mid-40s, claiming ownership of a blue Lamborghini. No ID presented yet. Requesting backup," she sighed. "I offered my ID. You told me not to move." "Ma'am, just cooperate," he said, but his tone wasn't cooperative. It was commanding, edged with something close to impatience. She took a breath. Fine, let me get my city ID from my pocket slowly. She moved her hand toward her blazer, fingers just brushing the fabric. Get on the ground. The second officer shouted suddenly. What? She said, startled. Now. Face down, hands behind your back. People gasped. Someone yelled, She's the mayor! But the officers didn't hesitate. Before she could speak again, strong hands grabbed her shoulders and shoved her forward. Her knees hit the pavement hard. Her palms scraped against the rough concrete as she tried to brace herself. Pain shot up her wrists. She cried out, not in fear but in shock and indignity. Stop. I haven't done anything, she said, her voice cracking. Don't resist. One of them barked, wrenching her arms behind her back. I'm not resisting. I'm your mayor. But they weren't hearing her. They were focused on control, on dominance, on the story they'd already written in their heads. A black woman in an expensive car must be up to no good. The truth didn't fit their script, so they ignored it. As they cuffed her wrists, tight enough to cut off circulation, she kept speaking. Not pleading, but stating facts as if logic could break through their bias. My name is Evelyn Thorne. I live 3 blocks from here. I paid for this car with my own money. I was elected by the people of this city. You are arresting your own mayor for walking to work. A young man in a coffee shop apron stepped forward. Hey, that's really her. I serve her coffee every Tuesday. Another voice. I saw her on the news last week. But the officers ignored them too. One radioed in, suspect in custody, vehicle secured. She lay there, cheek pressed against the cold sidewalk, the taste of dust in her mouth. The hum of the city suddenly muffled, distant. Around her, phones kept recording. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from the crushing weight of being unseen, unheard, disbelieved, simply because of how she looked. After what felt like forever, one of the officers finally pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of her face. He walked toward City Hall, muttering into his radio. Minutes later, he returned, face pale. He looked down at her, then at his partner. We might have a problem, his partner frowned. What? The first officer swallowed hard. That's really the mayor. Silence fell over the street. The cuffs were removed quickly, almost frantically. Apologies tumbled out. Ma'am, we're so sorry. We didn't know. It was a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. Her suit was scuffed, her knees bruised, her dignity scraped raw. And the video already spreading across social media showed not a misunderstanding, but something far more troubling. A pattern. A reflex. A system that saw a black woman and assumed guilt before grace. She stood slowly, brushing off her blazer, refusing the officer's offered hand. She looked him in the eye. You didn't not know, she said quietly. You chose not to believe. Then she turned, walked past the gawking crowd, past her gleaming Lamborghini, and up the steps of City Hall, head high, back straight, heart heavy, but unbroken. The meeting would start in 20 minutes, and she had a city to lead. The moment the mayor stepped through the heavy oak doors of City Hall, the air changed. It wasn't just cooler inside, though the marble floors and high ceilings always made it feel like stepping into a different season. It was the sudden hush, the way people froze mid-stride, eyes wide, phone still in hand. Word had already raced through the building. Someone had seen it from a third-floor window. Another had watched the live video stream on their phone while waiting for coffee. By the time she reached the lobby, a small group had gathered near the security desk, whispering, glancing toward the entrance like they expected chaos to walk in behind her. She didn't look at them. She kept walking, heels clicking with quiet determination even though her knees ached and her wrists still throbbed from the cuffs. Her chief of staff met her just outside the elevator, face pale, eyes red-rimmed. Are you okay? The aide asked, voice cracking. I'm fine, she said, though her voice was rougher than usual. Just bruised and furious. The aide nodded quickly, already pulling out a phone. I've got legal on standby. Press office is drafting a statement. The police chief just called. He's on his way. Good, she said. But I don't want a statement yet. I want the footage. Within minutes, someone from IT pulled the security camera feed from the front plaza. They watched in silence as the video played. Her stepping out of the car, calm and composed. The officers arriving with unnecessary urgency. The escalation that made no sense. The tackle that sent her to the ground like a criminal. One staffer turned away, hand over her mouth. Another muttered, "That's not just a mistake. That's something else." Meanwhile, outside, the scene hadn't ended. The two officers stood by their cruisers looking uneasy, shifting their weight. Avoiding the stares of the growing crowd, a local news van pulled up. Reporters jumped out, microphones in hand. Bystanders kept filming. One young woman, still holding her dog's leash, shouted, "She's the mayor!" "You just tackled the mayor." The officers didn't respond. They just stood there, suddenly very small in their uniforms. By 9:30 a.m., the video had been shared over 12,000 times. By noon, it was trending locally. By 2 p.m., national news outlets had picked it up. Headlines read, "Mayor tackled outside City Hall. Black female mayor arrested in own car. Crestwood police face backlash after violent stop." The footage was everywhere. On Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. People weren't just watching. They were reacting. Comments flooded in. "This is why we march." Would this happen if she were white? She was wearing a suit and walking into City Hall. At the police station, things were tense. The mayor hadn't been formally charged. There was never any real evidence of wrongdoing, but she had been detained for nearly 2 hours while they verified her identity. Even after her aide arrived with her official city ID, driver's license, car title, and even a printed copy of her election certificate, the desk sergeant had taken his time processing the paperwork. As if reluctant to admit error, she sat in a cold, windowless room, arms crossed, watching the clock tick. Every minute felt like an insult. Back at City Hall, her team scrambled. Some wanted to call a press conference immediately. Others urged caution. Wait for the police report, let tempers cool. But she knew better. Silence would be read as weakness. Or worse, acceptance. "I'm not hiding," she told her team. "And I'm not pretending this didn't happen." By late afternoon, she stood at the podium in the City Hall press room. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. She wore the same navy suit, though now it bore faint scuff marks on the knees. She didn't mention them. She didn't need to. "This morning," she began, voice clear and steady, "I was walking into my workplace, the building I was elected to lead, when I was stopped, questioned, and forcibly restrained by officers who refused to believe I owned the car I was driving." She paused. They didn't ask for my ID, they didn't call dispatch to verify. They saw a black woman in a luxury vehicle and assumed the worst. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. But her words carried weight because they were true. And because everyone watching knew it could have been them, or their sister, their mother, their friend. "I am not here to attack the entire police force," she continued. "Many officers serve this city with honor. But what happened today wasn't about one bad call. It was about a pattern. It was about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't." The room was silent. Even the usual shuffling of notebooks stopped. That evening, the city erupted, not in violence but in voices. A peaceful gathering formed outside the police headquarters. People held candles, signs that read, "Believe black women," and "Respect starts with seeing." Local pastors, teachers, small business owners, all showed up. One elderly man, a retired postal worker, stood with a handmade sign. "I voted for her." "Did you?" Inside the station, the two officers sat in separate interview rooms. Internal Affairs had launched an immediate investigation. Body cam footage confirmed what the bystander videos showed. No aggression from the mayor, no resistance, no justification for physical force. Worse, the audio captured one officer saying, "She doesn't look like she drives this," before the takedown. That line alone would haunt the department for weeks. The police chief held his own press conference that night. He apologized for the distress caused and called the incident deeply regrettable. But he stopped short of admitting racial bias. Instead, he blamed a breakdown in protocol and promised a thorough review. The mayor watched his statement on her living room TV, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "He's sorry I was embarrassed," she said to her aide, who sat beside her on the couch. Not that it happened. The next day, the city council called an emergency session. Council members who had rarely spoken to her before now rushed to express support. One even proposed a resolution condemning racial profiling. But she knew words were easy. She wanted action. Meanwhile, the officers remained on duty, though reassigned to desk work, while the investigation continued. That decision sparked fresh outrage. Protesters returned, louder this time. Community leaders demanded they be suspended immediately. A local civil rights group announced they were filing a federal complaint, but the mayor stayed focused. She met with the head of the police union, not to argue but to listen. She invited neighborhood leaders to City Hall for a town hall that weekend. She made sure every news outlet knew she was open to dialogue, but not to empty gestures. What surprised her most wasn't the anger, it was the messages. Hundreds poured into her office email, her social media, even handwritten letters left at the front desk. A teenage girl wrote, "You made me believe I could be mayor too." A white retiree said, "I never thought about this before. Thank you for opening my eyes." A young black man shared, "Last year, cops pulled me over for driving while black. Seeing you stand tall gave me hope." She read everyone. Some made her cry. Others made her angry all over again. But all of them reminded her why she'd run for office in the first place, not for power but for people. By the end of the week, the police department released the full body cam footage. It was worse than anyone imagined. The officers' tone, their assumptions, their refusal to de-escalate, it was all there in stark, undeniable detail. Public pressure mounted. Even the mayor's political opponents called for accountability. Still, she refused to call for the officers to be fired outright. "Due process matters," she told a reporter. "But so does truth. And the truth is, this wouldn't have happened if I looked different." Her restraint surprised some, but those who knew her understood. She wasn't interested in revenge. She was building something better. On Saturday morning, she walked back to City Hall, this time in a simple blouse and slacks. No Lamborghini, just her old sedan. A small crowd waited outside. They didn't cheer. They just nodded. Some clapped softly. One woman handed her a single white rose. She took it, smiled, and kept walking. Inside, she reviewed the first draft of a new policy proposal. Mandatory bias training for all city employees, a civilian oversight board with real power, and a presumption of legitimacy rule, requiring officers to assume a person belongs where they are unless proven otherwise. It wouldn't fix everything overnight. But it was a start. And as she sat at her desk, sunlight streaming through the same window she'd pointed to days earlier, she knew one thing for certain. What they meant to break, they had only strengthened. She wasn't just the mayor of Crestwood. She was its conscience, and its voice for those who'd been silenced too long. The days after the incident blurred together in a strange mix of exhaustion and urgency. The mayor barely slept. Not because she was afraid, she'd faced harder nights, but because her mind wouldn't stop turning. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pavement rushing up to meet her, felt the rough grip on her arms, heard the disbelief in the officer's voice when she said who she was. It wasn't just what happened, it was what it meant. And what it revealed. By the following Monday, the city was still buzzing. Coffee shops, bus stops, school pickup lines, everyone was talking about it. Some folks were angry, others were ashamed. A few quietly admitted they'd never really thought about how often this kind of thing happened to people who looked like her. That, more than anything, gave her hope. Because change didn't start with shouting, it started with seeing. She called a meeting with her senior staff early that morning. No press, no cameras, just the people who'd been with her through thick and thin. She sat at the head of the long wooden table, hands folded, calm but focused. "We can't just move on," she said. "This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a symptom. And if we don't treat the disease, it'll happen again, to someone else, maybe someone who doesn't have a title to fall back on." Her team nodded. They'd already drafted a list of immediate steps. Release all footage, launch an independent review, suspend the officers pending investigation. But she wanted more. She wanted something that would last long after the headlines faded. That afternoon, she met with the police chief, not in his office, not in hers, but in a neutral space, a quiet community center in the north end of the city, far from City Hall's marble and glass. The chief arrived looking tired, his uniform crisp but his eyes shadowed. He'd been getting heat from all sides. Protesters outside his house, calls from the state attorney general. Even his own officers divided on what to do. They sat across from each other at a folding table, 2 cups of bad coffee between them. "I'm sorry," he said before she could speak. "Truly." She looked at him, not with anger but with something heavier, disappointment. "I believe you mean that," she said. "But sorry doesn't stop it from happening again." He sighed. You're right. And I know our training hasn't kept up. We drill officers on use of force on de-escalation, but we don't drill them on bias. Not really. Not in a way that sticks. Then let's fix that, she said. Not as punishment. As prevention. They talked for over an hour. Not as mayor and chief, but as two people who loved the same city and wanted it to be better. By the end, they'd agreed on three things. First, an outside civil rights firm would lead a full audit of the department's policies and culture. Second, every officer would undergo mandatory, in-depth implicit bias training. Not a 1-hour online module, but real, uncomfortable human conversations led by experts. Third, they'd create a new rule. Before any physical force is used in a non-violent situation, the officer must confirm the person's identity and intent. No assumptions. No shortcuts. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. News of the agreement spread fast. Some activists called it too little. Others called it a start. The mayor didn't mind either reaction. She knew real change was slow, messy, and rarely applauded in the moment. Then came the body cam footage. The police department released it on a Tuesday evening, unedited, with timestamps and audio intact. Within hours, it was everywhere. People watched in silence as the mayor calmly identified herself, offered proof, asked for patience, and was met with suspicion, then force. The most chilling moment wasn't the tackle. It was the seconds before when one officer muttered, "She doesn't look like she belongs in that car," and the other didn't correct him. That quiet agreement said more than any policy ever could. The next morning, the mayor held a press conference not to rehash the pain, but to point forward. "This footage isn't just about me," she said, standing in front of a simple backdrop with the city seal. "It's about every person who's been followed in a store, pulled over for no reason, or told they don't belong somewhere they've every right to be." Today I had a title that eventually got me heard. But what about the teenager walking home from school? The grandmother visiting her grandkids? They don't have a press secretary. They just have their dignity, and too often that's not enough. Her words hit hard. Local news stations played the clip on loop. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about fairness. Even high school students organized a walkout. Not in anger, but in solidarity, wearing blue, the color of her suit that day, as a symbol of respect. Meanwhile, the two officers involved were placed on administrative leave. Not fired, due process mattered, but removed from the streets while the investigation continued. The police union pushed back, calling it rushed judgment, but public opinion had shifted. Even longtime supporters of the department admitted something was broken. The mayor didn't gloat. She didn't call for their heads. Instead, she asked for something harder, accountability that led to growth. They made a choice, she told a local radio host. Now they have to face it. But if they're willing to learn, to really examine why they saw a threat where there was none, then maybe this moment can teach us all something. Behind the scenes, she was working nonstop. She met with civil rights leaders, faith groups, neighborhood associations. She listened more than she spoke. One evening, she sat in a folding chair at a church basement in the East Side, surrounded by mothers who'd raised sons in this city. One woman, her voice trembling, said, "My boy got stopped 3 times last year. Just for walking. He's 16. He carries his student ID in his front pocket now like a shield." The mayor reached over and squeezed her hand. No one should have to prove they belong in their own city. That night she went home and wrote a new proposal, a dignity verification policy. It would require officers in non-emergency stops to state clearly why they're stopping someone, and give the person a chance to explain before any escalation. Simple, human, revolutionary only because it hadn't been done before. City council members were nervous. It might slow down response times, one argued. Or it might prevent another video like mine, she replied. Slowly, support grew. Even skeptical council members began to see it wasn't about blaming police. It was about building trust. And trust, she reminded them, was the foundation of real safety. Then came the state's attention. A state senator called, offering to sponsor a bill based on Crestwood's reforms. National civil rights organizations reached out, asking if they could use the city as a model. Suddenly, what had started as a local scandal was becoming a blueprint. But the mayor stayed grounded. She knew symbols weren't enough. So she did something unexpected. She invited the two officers to a private meeting, not to confront them, not to shame them, but to talk. They came, hesitant, eyes downcast. She served tea. No cameras, no notes, just three people in a quiet room. "I don't know what you were thinking that morning," she began, "but I need you to tell me honestly." One officer spoke first. "I saw the car, and I just assumed. I didn't think a black woman would own something like that." "I know that sounds awful, but it's true," the other added. "We got a call about a suspicious person. When we saw you, it fit the picture in our heads, even though it shouldn't have." She listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't scold. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally, "because now you see it. And seeing it is the first step to changing it." She didn't forgive them on the spot. Forgiveness wasn't hers to give lightly, but she offered them a path. Go through the training, speak openly about what happened, help redesign the department's approach. "Turn your mistake into a lesson," she said, "for yourselves and for others." They left quietly, but something had shifted. In the weeks that followed, the city began to heal. Not perfectly, not overnight, but visibly. Community police dialogue started happening monthly. Officers began riding along with youth mentors. The mayor made surprise visits to precincts not to inspect, but to listen. And every morning she still drove her Lamborghini to work. Not to prove a point, but because it was hers. And she refused to be made small by anyone's doubt. One afternoon, a little girl waiting outside City Hall with her class field trip pointed at the car and asked her teacher, "Is that the mayor's?" "Yes," the teacher said. The girl grinned. Cool. That small moment, simple, ordinary, full of possibility, was worth more than any apology, because now, in Crestwood, a black girl could see herself in that car. And that changed everything. The city didn't change overnight, but something had shifted in the air, like the quiet hum before a storm breaks. Except this time, it was the sound of people finally listening. The mayor could feel it in the way neighbors greeted each other on the street, in the tone of radio call-in shows, even in the way officers nodded at her now, not with stiffness, but with something closer to respect. But she knew feelings weren't enough. Real change needed structure. It needed rules that couldn't be ignored when the cameras turned off. She spent the next few weeks working with a small team of lawyers, community organizers, and even a few retired police trainers to draft what would become known as the Crestwood Public Safety Reform Package. It wasn't flashy. There were no grand promises or dramatic slogans. Just clear, practical steps designed to stop situations like hers from ever happening again, and to repair the trust that had been broken long before that morning on the sidewalk. The first piece was the duty to verify policy. From now on, any officer stopping someone for suspicion of theft, trespassing, or unauthorized use of property would be required to ask for identification and give the person a chance to explain before escalating to physical force, unless there was an immediate threat. No more assumptions. No more "she doesn't look like she belongs." Just facts, questions, and time. The second part was mandatory. In-person implicit bias training, not a checkbox exercise, but real workshops led by psychologists and community members who'd lived the experience. Officers would sit in circles, not rows. They'd hear stories, not lectures. And they'd be tested, not on memorization, but on how they responded in simulated scenarios. The third piece was the creation of a civilian oversight board, not just for show, but with real power, the ability to review complaints, recommend discipline, and even sit in on internal investigations. Half the members would be appointed by the mayor, half elected by neighborhood councils, and crucially, they'd include people who'd been stopped, questioned, or treated unfairly by police in the past. When the proposal was presented to the city council, the room was packed. People stood in the aisles. Cameras lined the back wall. Some came to support, others came skeptical, arms crossed, waiting for empty promises. The mayor didn't stand at the podium and shout. She walked slowly to the front, placed a single sheet of paper on the table, and spoke like she was talking to a neighbor over coffee. "This isn't about punishing good officers," she said. "It's about protecting everyone, officers and citizens alike, from the harm that comes when fear overrides fairness." Told them about the retired teacher who'd been followed in a department store last year, about the college student who got pulled over, 3 times in 1 month for driving while black. About the delivery driver who was told to prove he worked for the company he'd driven for 5 years. These aren't isolated incidents, she said. They're symptoms of a system that's been allowed to operate on instinct instead of integrity. Then she did something unexpected. She invited one of the officers involved in her own case to speak. He walked to the microphone, visibly nervous, his uniform crisp, but his hands trembling slightly. He didn't make excuses. He didn't say mistakes were made. He said, "I was wrong. I saw a car I thought didn't match the person driving it, and I let that thought override my training. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and I damaged trust I didn't even realize I was holding." The room was silent. You could hear someone sniffle in the back. "I've been through the new training," he continued, "and it's hard. It makes you look at things you didn't want to see in yourself, but I'm better for it, and I hope our department will be too." When he stepped down, there was no applause, just a slow, steady nod from people who'd been waiting years to hear an officer say something like that. The vote happened that same evening. The council passed the reform package unanimously, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Even the most cautious members admitted, if the mayor could be treated that way, what chance did anyone else have? Implementation began the next week. Training sessions rolled out in shifts. The Oversight Board held its first public forum in a high school gym, where over 300 residents showed up, not to yell but to share. One woman brought her teenage son. "I want him to know the city is trying," she said. Meanwhile, the state took notice. A bipartisan group of lawmakers invited the mayor to testify at the Capitol. She went, not in a limo but on the morning train, briefcase in hand, same as always. In the hearing room, she didn't speak as a victim. She spoke as a leader. "Our city didn't wait for a tragedy to act," she told the committee. "We used a moment of failure to build something better. And if Crestwood can do it, with its modest budget and complicated history, then any city can." Her testimony sparked a wave. 3 other cities announced they'd adopt similar reforms. A National Policing Institute asked to study Crestwood's model. Even the Department of Justice reached out, offering technical support. But back home, the real work continued quietly. Officers started wearing body cams not just as a requirement, but as a tool for accountability and for protection. Community walks became monthly events. Officers and residents walking the same blocks together, not in uniform, just as people. Kids began calling the local precinct the friendly station because the officers there now knew their names. The mayor made sure the reforms weren't just top-down. She held listening dinners in different neighborhoods, simple meals in church basements or community centers where she'd sit at a table with 6 or 8 residents and just talk, no agenda, no speeches, just human connection. One night in a working-class neighborhood on the south side, an older man leaned across the table and said, "You know, I used to think City Hall didn't care about folks like us, but you keep showing up, even after what they did to you." She looked at him and smiled. "They didn't break me," she said. "They reminded me why I'm here. Not everything was smooth. Some officers resisted the new training. A few even transferred out of the department. But others, many others, leaned in. One sergeant started a mentorship program pairing veteran officers with young people from neighborhoods they'd once only patrolled. Another began teaching de-escalation techniques to recruits, using the mayor's case as a cautionary tale. And slowly, the numbers began to shift. Complaints about racial profiling dropped by 40% in 6 months. Trust in local police, measured by an independent survey, rose for the first time in a decade. Crime didn't spike. It actually dipped slightly as community cooperation led to better tips and faster resolutions. The mayor never took credit. "This wasn't my victory," she told a local paper. "It was ours. Every person who spoke up, showed up, or simply chose to believe change was possible. They're the ones who made this happen." Even the media began to shift its tone. Instead of mayor-tackled headlines, stories now read, "Crestwood becomes national model for police reform," or "From scandal to solution, how one city healed." But the most powerful moment came on a rainy Thursday in late fall. The mayor was walking to her car after a long day when a young girl, maybe 10 years old, ran up to her, holding a handmade card. Her mother stood a few steps behind, smiling nervously. The girl thrust the card forward. "I made this for you," she said. The mayor knelt, ignoring the puddles, and opened it. Inside, in bright crayon, was a drawing of a woman in a blue suit standing tall next to a shiny car, with a police officer shaking her hand. Above it, in careful letters, "Thank you for making our city fair." She looked up, eyes glistening. "This means more to me than you know," the girl beamed. "My teacher said you didn't let them make you small." "No," the mayor said softly, "and neither should you." That night, she pinned the drawing to her office wall, right next to the city charter, because real change wasn't measured in policies alone. It was measured in moments like this, when a child believed she could belong, could lead, could be seen for who she truly was. And in Crestwood, that belief was finally taking root. A year had passed since that morning on the sidewalk outside City Hall. The seasons had turned, the headlines had faded, and life in Crestwood had settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that still carried the echoes of what happened, but no longer lived in its shadow. The mayor stood on the steps of the same building where it all began, not for a press conference or a crisis, but for something quieter, more meaningful, the graduation of the city's first community police leadership academy. The sun was warm, the sky clear. Families filled the plaza with lawn chairs and picnic blankets. Kids ran between the legs of adults laughing. Officers in dress uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder with teenagers from neighborhoods once labeled high risk. These weren't recruits headed for the force, though some might choose that path later. They were students who'd spent the last 6 months learning about civic duty, conflict resolution, and what it really means to protect and serve. Half were from the police department's youth outreach program. The other half were kids who'd once viewed officers with suspicion, some with good reason. The mayor watched them line up, nervous but proud, certificates in hand. She didn't speak first. She let a 17-year-old girl from the east side take the mic. Her voice shook at first, then grew stronger. "Before this program," she said, "I thought cops only saw me as a problem. But Officer Ruiz, he listened. He asked about my dreams. He didn't treat me like I was guilty of something I hadn't done." She paused, looked out at the crowd. "Now I want to be a lawyer, so I can help people like me get a fair chance." A murmur of pride rippled through the audience. The mayor smiled. This was the legacy she'd hoped for. Not revenge, not blame, but bridges. Later that afternoon, she walked through the plaza, shaking hands, hugging kids, accepting hugs from parents who whispered, "Thank you." No one mentioned the incident directly. They didn't need to. It was part of the story now, like a scar that reminded you of healing, not just hurt. Back in her office, things had changed too. The oversight board met every month, and their recommendations were taken seriously, not just filed away. Complaints were investigated within 10 days. Body cam footage was reviewed not just when something went wrong, but as part of routine checks to spot patterns before they became problems. And the duty to verify rule? It had prevented at least a dozen unnecessary escalations, according to internal reports. One officer even wrote a note saying it helped him avoid a mistake during a late-night stop. He'd assumed a young man was breaking into a car, only to learn he was a rideshare driver waiting for his passenger. Because he asked first, no one got hurt. The mayor kept her Lamborghini. She still parked it in front of City Hall most days. But now, instead of stares or suspicion, people just waved. Sometimes kids pointed and said, "That's the mayor's car," like it was the most normal thing in the world. And in Crestwood, it was. Nationally, the city had become a quiet beacon, not because it was perfect, no place was, but because it chose to face its flaws instead of hiding them. Mayors from other cities visited, not for photo ops, but to sit in on training sessions and ask hard questions. A documentary crew filmed a short piece on the reforms, but the mayor insisted they focus on the community, not her. "This isn't my story," she told the producer. "It's ours." She'd turned down book deals, speaking tours, even whispers of a run for higher office. Not because she lacked ambition, but because she believed real leadership happened where you were planted, and Crestwood still needed tending. One evening, she attended a neighborhood meeting in a part of town that had long felt forgotten. The community center was small, the chairs mismatched, but the turnout was strong. People talked about streetlights, bus routes, after-school programs, not just policing, but the everyday things that make a city livable. An older man stood up and said, "I used to think City Hall only cared about downtown, but now I see you here, regular, listening." She nodded. "Because you matter. All of you. After the meeting, as she walked to her car, a young officer she recognized from the early days of the reform approached. He'd been one of the skeptics, quiet during training, arms crossed. Now he stood straighter, his eyes clear. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to say." "I get it now," she stopped.
Get what?
"That it's not about being tough. It's about being fair, and that trust isn't given, it's earned. Every single day." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Then keep earning it." He nodded, touched his cap, and walked away. She watched him go, not as an enemy, not as a symbol, but as a person trying to do better. And that, she thought, was the real victory. Life wasn't without challenges. There were still nights when she lay awake, replaying that moment on the pavement. There were still critics who said she'd gone too far, or not far enough. And yes, there were still moments of bias, because changing systems doesn't erase centuries of history overnight. But what had changed was the response. Now, when something went wrong, people didn't just shrug or shout. They came together. They asked, "And how do we fix this?" Instead of, "Whose fault is it?" At a town hall that spring, someone asked her what she was most proud of. She didn't say the policy changes or the national attention. She said, "I'm proud that a black girl can walk into a luxury car dealership in this city and be treated like a customer, not a suspect. I'm proud that a young man can wear a hoodie at night and not be followed. I'm proud that we're learning to see each other, not as threats but as neighbors." The room fell quiet. Then someone started clapping. Soon the whole room was on its feet. Later, as she drove home, windows down, music low, she passed the spot where it happened. There was no marker, no plaque, but she slowed for just a second, not out of pain but out of purpose. That moment hadn't defined her, it had redirected her, and in doing so, it had helped redirect a whole city. She pulled into her driveway, a modest house on a tree-lined street. No gates, no guards, just a front porch with 2 rocking chairs and a pot of blooming geraniums. Her partner was waiting, holding a glass of iced tea. "You look tired," they said. "I am," she admitted, sinking into a chair. "But it's a good tired." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Fireflies blinked in the yard. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. "You know," she said after a while, "they saw a black woman in a Lamborghini and assumed theft. But what they didn't see was everything behind it. The years of work, the sacrifices, the belief that I belong just as much as anyone." She took a sip of tea. "Now, I hope they see something else. Not just me, but the possibility in everyone who's been told they don't fit." Her partner reached over and squeezed her hand. "You didn't just survive that day. You turned it into something that helps others." She smiled. "That's the point, isn't it? To make sure no one else has to go through it alone." Inside the house, the phone rang. It was a reporter from a national magazine, asking for a final quote for a feature on cities leading the way in equity and public safety. She thought for a moment, then said simply, "We are not perfect, but we're trying, and sometimes trying is the bravest thing a city can do." She hung up, turned off the porch light, and went inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new meetings, new chances to build something better. But for now, in the quiet of her home, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that the work mattered, the people mattered, and that even the deepest wounds could become the roots of something strong. Because in Crestwood, justice wasn't just a word on a courthouse wall. It was a practice, a promise, a daily choice. And she would keep choosing it as long as she had breath and as long as her city needed her to.